Before we dive into this heart-wrenching tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more incredible stories of courage, survival, and the unbreakable bond between humans and wildlife. The Arctic was no place for the faint of heart. Underneath the deceptive beauty of endless white stretched a frozen wilderness fraught with danger. Miles away from any signs of civilization, a storm was brewing, a monster of ice and wind, roaring across the tundra with unstoppable fury. But amidst this merciless chaos, life clung to hope in the form of a tiny polar bear cub. The cub had been separated from his mother during a sudden whiteout, a blinding blizzard that had swallowed the horizon in moments. He was too young to fend for himself, his fur damp and clinging to his trembling body as the wind screamed around him. Each step across the ice felt heavier than the last, his small paws sinking into the snow that seemed to stretch forever. He whimpered, a sound too soft to pierce the storm's wrath, as if calling for a mother who might never hear him again. At the same time, hundreds of miles south, a man named Caleb was preparing for a journey unlike any he had ever undertaken. Caleb wasn't a survivalist or a professional explorer. He was an environmental scientist, driven by a deep sense of responsibility for the planet's most vulnerable creatures. For years, he'd been documenting the impacts of climate change, capturing the loss and struggle that often went unseen. But nothing could prepare him for what was to come. Caleb's destination was the edge of the Arctic shelf, where he hoped to capture footage of polar bears in their natural habitat, footage that would move people, that would make them care. He knew the risks. The Arctic was no place to make mistakes. Yet, as he loaded his gear onto a snowmobile, the urgency in his heart outweighed the fear in his gut. Two lives were about to collide, one fragile and desperate, the other determined and fearless. And as the storm raged on, neither Caleb nor the little cub could have known how fate was already weaving their stories together. The storm thickened, a howling beast that clawed at the heavens and turned the world into a furious swirl of white. The cub's small frame shivered as frost clung to his fur, his breath coming in sharp, visible puffs. His nose, keen with the instinctual sense passed down from generations, twitched for any scent that might lead him to safety. The scent of his mother had faded with the storm, swallowed by the relentless wind. Fear crept into his tiny heart, tightening its grip with every passing moment of isolation. He stumbled forward, one paw slipping through a thin patch of ice. A sharp crack echoed beneath him, reverberating through his bones as the fragile layer threatened to give way. He pulled back, his limbs trembling as he narrowly avoided plunging into the icy abyss below. Time was running out. Far away, Caleb's snowmobile powered through the Arctic wilderness, the machine's headlights cutting a narrow path through the encroaching storm. His gear was packed with cameras, lenses, and notebooks filled with meticulous observations. But it wasn't the equipment that weighed heavy on his mind, it was the burden of the stories he had heard and the ones he hoped to tell. Stories of ice melting beneath paws, of mothers losing their cubs to the unforgiving sea. He thought of the article he had read just days before. The Last Polar Bears of a Dying World, it had been called. It spoke of a shrinking wilderness, of creatures forced to swim miles across open water in a desperate search for ice that no longer remained. The words haunted him, each letter a reminder of humanity's impact on a fragile ecosystem. His mission wasn't just about documenting nature, it was about giving a voice to the silent victims of climate change. As the snowmobile jolted over uneven terrain, Caleb's eyes scanned the horizon. Visibility was a challenge. The storm wrapped around him like a thick curtain, hiding the dangers that lurked beneath its icy folds. He gripped the handlebars tighter, adrenaline sharpening his senses. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his attention, a blur of white against white, a flicker almost impossible to see. He stopped. For a moment, there was only the wind, a deafening force that roared like an ocean of frozen air. He squinted into the distance, heart pounding as he searched for the source of the movement. And then he saw it, small, fragile, barely more than a shadow against the storm's fury. A polar bear cub, alone and trembling, its tiny form a stark contrast to the vast emptiness around it. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He had seen many things in his travels, majestic beasts battling the elements, the raw power of nature unfolding before his eyes, but this was different. This was vulnerability, pure and unfiltered. A creature so young, so full of life and potential, now teetering on the edge of disaster. The cub took a step, its paws slipping once again on the treacherous ice. Caleb's instincts roared to life. His mind raced with possibilities, calculations of distance and risk. The storm was growing fiercer by the second, a living force that threatened to consume them both. But there was no hesitation in his heart. He moved swiftly, abandoning the snowmobile as he grabbed a length of rope and a thick tarp from his gear. His boots crunched against the snow as he advanced, every step a battle against the wind that pushed against him with relentless strength. The cub turned its head, dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Caleb dropped to one knee, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He knew better than to startle the young bear. His voice, though barely audible over the storm, was soft and soothing, a sound of calm in a world gone mad. "It's okay, little one," he murmured, his words a lifeline cast into the tempest. "I'm here to help. You're not alone." The cub tilted its head, ears flicking as it registered the unfamiliar sound. Trust was a fragile thing, a bridge built one careful step at a time. Caleb reached out with the rope, looping it gently around the bear's small body. It didn't resist, whether from exhaustion or an instinctual understanding of safety, Caleb couldn't be sure. He worked quickly, securing the cub within the makeshift sling of the tarp. The wind howled in protest as he lifted the fragile bundle into his arms. The weight of the cub pressed against his chest, a reminder of the precious life he now carried. Every second mattered. As he turned back toward the snowmobile, the ice beneath him groaned, a low, ominous sound that sent a jolt of fear through his spine. He froze, breath hitching as the ground shifted beneath his feet. Thin ice. He had crossed onto a section of the shelf weakened by the warming temperatures. The storm had hidden its danger, but now it revealed its deadly truth. A split-second decision. Caleb lunged forward, his boots slamming against solid ground as the ice behind him gave way. The crack spread like lightning, a jagged scar that raced across the frozen surface before disappearing into the distance. He didn't stop to look back. The cub whimpered softly, its tiny body pressed close against him as he pushed onward, every muscle burning with exertion. He reached the snowmobile, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Carefully, he placed the cub into a secured section of his cargo space, wrapping it with layers of insulation to keep it warm. His hands trembled as he worked, the adrenaline coursing through his veins making his fingers clumsy. With the cub safe, he climbed back onto the vehicle and gunned the engine. The storm roared louder, but Caleb's determination drowned out its fury. This was a battle of wills, man versus nature, hope against despair. As he sped away from the collapsing ice, a thought echoed in his mind. Sometimes, it takes just one act of courage to change everything. The storm had grown into a blinding nightmare, a chaotic swirl that erased the boundaries between sky and earth. Snow whipped across Caleb's face, stinging like shards of glass as he drove the snowmobile through the unforgiving wilderness. The engine roared beneath him, its mechanical growl battling against the relentless wind. His mind raced as fast as the machine, every thought focused on one urgent question: where could he find shelter? The cub stirred behind him, nestled within the insulated tarp. Caleb could feel its slight movements, the soft press of tiny paws against the material. Its breath was warm, a fragile pulse of life in a world of cold death. He glanced over his shoulder, heart tightening at the sight of the small bundle. The cub's dark eyes met his, wide with fear but filled with a glimmer of trust that cut straight to his soul. Every second in this storm was a gamble. The Arctic was merciless to those who lingered too long in its grasp. Caleb knew that hypothermia could claim both of them if they didn't find cover soon. He scanned the landscape, searching desperately for anything that could serve as a refuge. His breath fogged the air, each exhalation a fleeting ghost swallowed by the freezing wind. Then, through the swirling snow, he saw it, a dark silhouette rising against the white horizon. A formation of ice and rock, jagged and irregular, but large enough to offer protection. It wasn't much, but it was hope. He steered toward it, heart pounding with a mixture of relief and urgency. The terrain grew rougher as he approached, the snowmobile jolting and shuddering beneath him. He gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the handlebars so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A sudden lurch sent the vehicle skidding sideways, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought it would tip over. He leaned into the movement, muscles straining as he fought to regain control. They reached the outcrop. Caleb leapt off the snowmobile, his boots crunching against the snow as he moved quickly to retrieve the cub. The little bear whimpered, its body trembling as he lifted it into his arms once more. "Hang in there, buddy," he whispered, his voice hoarse with cold and worry. "We're going to make it. I promise." He carried the cub into a narrow crevice between the ice and rock. The space was tight, barely wide enough for him to crouch inside, but it provided a break from the wind's fury. The walls pressed close around them, icy and unyielding. Caleb set the cub down gently, wrapping it tighter in the tarp before sitting back against the rock. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, his heavy and ragged, the cub's soft and uneven. The storm raged on outside, a relentless force of nature that howled like a wounded animal. But inside this small, fragile shelter, there was a pocket of calm. Caleb reached into his pack, fingers numb as he searched for a thermal blanket. He found it, shaking it loose before draping it over both of them. The cub nestled closer, its warmth seeping into his chest like a tiny ember. He rubbed his hands together, trying to restore some feeling to his frozen fingers. Every muscle in his body ached, exhaustion pulling at him like a heavy weight. But sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, not now. The cub let out a soft, pitiful cry, a sound so small and sorrowful that it pierced through Caleb's exhaustion like a dagger. His heart ached with a fierce, protective tenderness. He placed a hand on the cub's side, feeling the rapid thump of its heartbeat beneath his palm. It was alive. That was all that mattered. He closed his eyes, drawing in a deep, steadying breath. Memories surfaced, unbidden, images of a life far removed from this frozen wasteland. He saw his childhood home, the warmth of a crackling fire, the smell of pine needles and hot cocoa. He remembered his father's stories, tales of bravery and kindness, of people who faced impossible odds and refused to give up. "Never underestimate the power of one good deed," his father had always said. "It might not change the whole world, but it can change one life. And sometimes, that's enough." Caleb opened his eyes, the weight of those words settling over him like a blanket of resolve. He looked down at the cub, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "We're going to get through this," he whispered, more to himself than to the bear. "I'm not giving up on you." Time crawled as the storm raged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The cold gnawed at his bones, but he refused to let it defeat him. He shifted slightly, positioning the thermal blanket to trap more heat. The cub let out a contented sigh, its small body relaxing against him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to ease. The wind softened, its howling cry fading into a whisper. The snow still fell, but it no longer swirled in a violent frenzy. A fragile silence descended, broken only by the sound of Caleb's breath and the soft, rhythmic snores of the sleeping cub. Relief washed over him, a tide of gratitude so powerful that tears pricked the corners of his eyes. He tilted his head back, staring up at the narrow slice of sky visible above the crevice. Stars glimmered faintly through the thinning clouds, tiny sparks of light in the vast darkness. They had survived the worst of it. But the journey wasn't over. Caleb knew the dangers that still lay ahead, the thin ice, the relentless cold, the hunger that would gnaw at their strength. But he also knew this: courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about moving forward in spite of it. He smiled faintly, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids as he cradled the cub closer. "Rest now, little one," he whispered. "Tomorrow, we keep fighting." The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a pale, fragile glow that barely touched the endless expanse of ice and snow. Caleb stirred from a restless sleep, his body aching from the cold and the cramped space between the ice and rock. His breath hung in the air like thin smoke, curling and fading as he opened his eyes. The cub was still nestled against him, its small body radiating warmth that had kept them both alive through the night. He placed a hand gently on its back, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breathing. Relief flooded his heart, it was still alive. The storm may have passed, but their fight was far from over. Caleb shifted slowly, careful not to disturb the cub as he reached for his pack. His fingers were stiff and clumsy from the cold, but he managed to pull out a ration bar and a flask of water. He took a small sip, the icy liquid stinging his throat before it brought a flicker of warmth to his core. Then he unwrapped the bar, breaking off a tiny piece to offer to the cub. "Here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's not much, but it'll help." The cub sniffed the morsel cautiously before taking it in its mouth. It chewed slowly, its dark eyes watching Caleb with a mixture of curiosity and trust. That trust, the fragile, unspoken bond between man and bear, was a force more powerful than any storm. With the cub fed and resting, Caleb turned his attention to the journey ahead. He peered out of the crevice, squinting against the glare of the rising sun as it reflected off the snow. The world had been transformed overnight, a glittering, frozen wasteland stretched as far as the eye could see. The storm had left behind a deceptive stillness, a calm that hid the perils lurking beneath the ice. He knew the dangers all too well. The Arctic was a place where life and death balanced on a knife's edge, where one wrong step could mean plunging into frigid waters with no way out. The cub wouldn't survive much longer without its mother, or without shelter and food. Caleb's mind raced with possibilities. Returning to his base camp wasn't an option. The distance was too great, and the cub's strength too fragile. There had to be another way. He thought of the research station he had passed 2 days earlier, a small outpost used by wildlife biologists studying polar bear behavior. It wasn't far, maybe a few hours' journey if they moved quickly. It was their best chance. With determination tightening in his chest, he gathered his gear and carefully bundled the cub into the tarp once more. "We're going to find help," he murmured, his breath a promise carried into the cold. "Hold on, little one. We're almost there." The snowmobile's engine growled to life, a sound that echoed across the desolate landscape. Caleb gripped the handlebars tightly, his eyes scanning the ice for cracks and weak spots. Every mile was a gamble, every second a test of endurance. The cub lay quietly behind him, its small frame swaying gently with the movement of the machine. As they sped across the ice, Caleb felt a strange sense of connection to the vast, untamed wilderness around him. The Arctic was harsh, unforgiving, but it was also beautiful. It was a place where survival demanded respect and resilience, where life thrived against impossible odds. He thought of the polar bears he had come to document, their world shrinking with every passing year as the ice melted beneath them. He felt a pang of sorrow, a grief that went beyond words. The cub in his care was a symbol of something far greater, a reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just about one life. It was about a future where creatures like this cub could still roam free, where the Arctic remained a sanctuary instead of a graveyard. The journey stretched on, each mile blending into the next as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Caleb's muscles ached, his fingers numb despite the gloves that covered them. But he pushed forward, driven by a force stronger than exhaustion. The cub needed him. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the ice, a movement so subtle that it almost escaped his notice. He slowed the snowmobile, eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. His heart leapt into his throat as he saw it, a large figure moving with deliberate grace, its massive paws pressing silently into the snow. A polar bear. Caleb's pulse quickened. He brought the snowmobile to a stop, his breath caught between hope and fear. The bear was enormous, its thick fur gleaming in the sunlight, its eyes sharp and focused. It moved with the confidence of a predator, each step a testament to its power. But there was something more. Trailing behind the bear, almost hidden against its vast frame, was another shape, small and stumbling. A cub. Caleb's heart surged with emotion. It wasn't the cub he had rescued, but it was a sign, a reminder that family bonds, even in the harshest places, endured. He watched as the mother bear turned her head, her gaze scanning the landscape with a fierce, protective intensity. The moment hung suspended in time, a perfect balance of instinct and connection. Caleb held his breath, the weight of the encounter pressing against his chest. He knew better than to interfere. This was nature's realm, its laws ancient and unbreakable. The mother bear sniffed the air, her keen senses attuned to every sound and scent. Caleb remained motionless, his body a still shadow against the snow. Slowly, the bear continued on, her cub trailing close behind. Together, they moved toward the horizon, their figures growing smaller until they disappeared into the endless white. Caleb exhaled, his breath a cloud of warmth in the frozen air. His eyes burned with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. "Family," he whispered, the word heavy with meaning. He looked back at the cub he had saved, its dark eyes meeting his with a quiet, trusting gaze. "Let's go find yours." The engine of the snowmobile growled steadily as Caleb drove across the desolate, glittering plain. The cub lay nestled behind him, its body tucked securely within the folds of the tarp. Each moment was heavy with urgency and hope, but every mile also brought a new threat. The Arctic wasn't a place that forgave mistakes. Thin ice, hidden crevasses, and unpredictable weather made every decision a matter of life and death. He glanced down at the gauges, heart pounding when the fuel indicator blinked red, low reserves. A knot of dread tightened in his chest. "Come on, not now," he muttered, his breath fogging the visor of his helmet. The research outpost was still miles away, a glimmer of salvation just out of reach. Pushing forward wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. The wind had quieted, but the silence that settled over the ice was deceptive. It wasn't peace, it was the stillness before another battle. Caleb's eyes scanned the horizon as he weaved carefully, every bump and shift of the terrain a potential hazard. Then it happened. The ice beneath the snowmobile cracked, a sharp, splintering sound that sliced through the air like a gunshot. Instinct took over. Caleb leaned back, wrenching the handlebars to redistribute the weight, but the machine lurched wildly, skidding sideways as the surface gave way. "Hold on," he shouted, though the cub could not understand his words. The snowmobile tipped. Caleb's body slammed against the ground, the breath knocked from his lungs as he rolled free from the tumbling vehicle. Ice shards flew in every direction, and the sound of rushing water filled his ears. The machine skidded to a stop near the edge of a gaping hole, half submerged in dark, frigid water. Caleb lay sprawled on the ice, heart hammering as he sucked in shallow, freezing breaths. Pain radiated through his limbs, but he forced himself to move, crawling on hands and knees toward the cub. It had been thrown free of the tarp. The small, white bundle lay just feet away, its tiny body trembling violently from the shock of the fall. "No, no, no," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with fear. He reached it in seconds, hands trembling as he scooped up the cub. Its eyes fluttered open, dazed and filled with terror. Caleb pulled it close, his arms a protective cage around its fragile form. The cub whimpered, its paws pressing weakly against his chest. "You're okay," he murmured, his voice a mix of reassurance and desperation. "I've got you. You're okay." The ice beneath them groaned, the sound of shifting pressure warning of imminent collapse. Caleb's mind raced. The snowmobile was a lost cause, it was wedged too deeply in the ice, its weight dragging it toward the freezing water below. But they had to move. Now. His feet scrambled for traction as he stood, gripping the cub tightly. Every step felt like walking a tightrope over a bottomless chasm. He could feel the ice sagging beneath his weight, the thin layer threatening to fracture completely. He kept his eyes on the surface, searching for signs of stability. Smooth, white ice was dangerous, rough, ridged patches offered better footing. He stepped carefully, muscles taut with concentration as he balanced the need for speed with the need for survival. When he finally reached solid ground, a wave of relief crashed over him. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees, still clutching the cub. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, the adrenaline that had kept him moving now leaving him weak and trembling. The cub shifted in his arms, its small tongue flicking out to lick his chin. The simple gesture, a flicker of affection from a creature so vulnerable, was enough to bring tears to his eyes. He held it tighter. "You're a fighter," he whispered. "Just like your mother would want you to be." But even as he spoke the words, a hollow ache grew within him. The mother bear. He had no way of knowing if she was alive, if she was still out there searching desperately for her lost cub. The thought of her roaming the ice, calling out into the void, made his heart ache in a way that was almost unbearable. He couldn't let that be the end of their story. Once more, he forced himself to rise, each step a painful act of defiance against the cold and exhaustion. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, but in the far distance, a shape began to emerge. His heart skipped. The outpost. The small, sturdy structure was just visible through the haze, a beacon of hope in a world of ice. It stood on stilts above the frozen ground, its walls reinforced against the Arctic's unforgiving storms. Caleb had visited it once before. He remembered the warmth of its insulated interior, the hum of its generators, and the safety it promised. But reaching it would be the final trial. The cub had grown still in his arms, its eyes half closed, its body limp with exhaustion. Its breaths came slow and shallow, a rhythm that spoke of fragility. Caleb felt its heartbeat against his chest, a fluttering reminder of how thin the line between life and death had become. Each step was agony, but he pushed forward. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he refused to stop. The wind picked up again, a cruel reminder that time was slipping away. When he finally reached the outpost, the sense of triumph was overwhelming. He stumbled to the door, shoulders slamming against it as he fumbled with the latch. His hands were shaking, the cold numbing his fingers, but desperation lent him strength. The door creaked open. Warmth enveloped them. Caleb collapsed inside, the cub still cradled against him as he kicked the door shut behind them. The silence that followed was profound, a stillness filled not with danger, but with the promise of safety. The cub let out a soft sigh, its small body relaxing completely for the first time. Caleb rested his forehead against its fur, his breath catching as emotion finally broke through the barriers he had held so tightly. They had made it. They had survived. The outpost was a sanctuary of warmth, a stark contrast to the frozen wilderness outside. Heat radiated from the wall-mounted furnace, and the soft hum of the generator was a comforting reminder that they were no longer at the mercy of the elements. Caleb's breath still came in shallow, ragged gasps as he lay on the floor, clutching the cub against his chest. The moment stretched, fragile and sacred. He could feel the cub's heartbeat against his own, a faint but determined rhythm that spoke of life, of hope, of the will to survive even in a world that seemed to conspire against it. He didn't know how long he remained there, his body trembling from exhaustion, his mind a blur of relief and lingering fear. But at last, a new urgency began to stir within him. The cub needed more than warmth. It needed nourishment. With careful, deliberate movements, Caleb sat up and looked around the small room. The outpost was modest, bare walls lined with shelves of supplies, a cot pushed against one side, a small table and chair near a window that offered a view of the endless white. He spotted a cabinet marked with the unmistakable red and white symbol for emergency provisions. "Hang on, little one," he murmured. "We're not done yet." He gently placed the cub on the floor, wrapping it snugly in his jacket to keep it warm. It stirred slightly, letting out a soft whimper before curling into a tight ball. Caleb's heart ached at the sound. Rummaging through the cabinet, he found a container of rehydration formula, something used by researchers for weakened wildlife, and a small bottle with a rubber nipple designed for feeding young animals. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. He mixed the formula quickly, his fingers clumsy with fatigue. Steam rose from the warmed liquid as he filled the bottle. Returning to the cub, he knelt beside it, cradling its fragile body in one arm as he offered the bottle with the other. "Come on," he whispered, his voice a plea. "You've got to try." The cub's nose twitched as it sniffed the bottle. Slowly, hesitantly, it opened its mouth and began to suckle. Caleb felt a swell of emotion so powerful it left him breathless. He watched the cub drink, each tiny gulp a victory, a triumph against the odds that had been stacked so cruelly against them both. Tears blurred his vision. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "I promise." As the cub drank, the fire in Caleb's chest grew, an unshakable resolve born not just from instinct, but from something deeper. He thought of the storm that had nearly taken them, the ice that had cracked beneath his feet, the long, harrowing journey that had brought them here. He thought of the mother bear, her image haunting his mind with every step he had taken. There was still a question that hung heavy in his heart: was she alive? He couldn't rest until he knew. Once the cub had finished drinking, it fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Its small body rose and fell with each breath, its fur warm against his hands. Caleb placed it gently on the cot, bundling it in a blanket before turning to the window. The Arctic stretched before him, vast and silent, a place of beauty and peril in equal measure. He knew it would be dangerous to venture out again, but the risk didn't matter. He had saved the cub, but there was one last piece of the story that needed to be written. Pulling his coat tight around his body, he stepped back into the bitter cold. The wind bit at his face, and the snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked. He didn't have far to go, just beyond a ridge where he had seen tracks earlier. He followed them now, each step driven by hope and determination. Minutes passed, then an hour, the sun dipping lower in the sky. His breath came in clouds as he trudged forward. And then he saw her. She stood alone against the horizon, her massive form silhouetted by the pale glow of twilight. Her fur was streaked with ice, her eyes scanning the landscape with a mixture of ferocity and desperation. She moved slowly, her head low, her paws pressing into the snow as though every step was a question without an answer. Caleb felt his heart break and mend in the same instant. He moved closer, careful not to startle her. The wind carried her scent to him, a sharp, wild aroma of salt and ice. She stopped, her body going rigid as her head snapped up. Their eyes met. For a long, breathless moment, there was only silence between them, a bridge of understanding that needed no words. She let out a low, mournful sound, a cry that resonated with the weight of her search. Caleb stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture of peace. "She's safe," he whispered, though the wind stole the sound from his lips. "Your cub is safe." He didn't know if she understood, but something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, a spark of shared purpose. Slowly, she turned, her eyes never leaving him as she moved back toward the ridge. Caleb followed, his heart hammering. When they reached the outpost, he opened the door. Warmth spilled into the night as he stepped aside. The mother bear paused, her massive form silhouetted against the light. Inside, the cub stirred, its small head lifting as it let out a plaintive cry. The mother bear stepped forward, her breath misting in the air as she moved into the warmth. Reunion. The cub tumbled from the cot, its legs wobbly but determined as it crossed the floor. It pressed against its mother's side, its small body lost in the vastness of her fur. She nuzzled it gently, a rumbling sound of relief and love vibrating from deep within her chest. Caleb watched, tears streaming down his face. He had witnessed many things in his life: storms, survival, the raw power of nature. But nothing compared to this. It was a moment of pure, unbreakable connection. He stepped back into the cold, giving them space, knowing that this was their world, their story. As he looked to the horizon, the first stars began to shine, their light reflected in the endless ice. A promise. A future. And hope.